Hello, Rupert. My name's Tom, in
Hello, Tom.
First Retreat, new to non-duality. So I have a question about non-duality. Does it have within its teachings a creation story? And I come from a Catholic background, so reading Genesis and saying, eating of the forbidden fruit, the original sin, the context of that, and a Messiah to follow, sin no more, and forgiveness and love, from that. Also, some of the channeled information talks about an error, E-E-R-R-O-R, an error occurring, and the need. Some of the channeled information is to awaken to the fact of your true nature as a solution. So I'm so new to non-duality. Is there a story, a creation type story,
Yes.
of why we are separate beings?
Yes, it's called Mary and Jane.
Oh no! I'm all ears.
Do you know about Mary and Jane?
I do not.
You do not, okay. Who else here does not know about Mary and Jane?
I am the only one.
Okay, there are three of you. Okay, so just very, very briefly, Mary, I've told it already, that this retreat, but very briefly, Mary falls asleep in Burlingame, and she dreams she's Jane on the streets of Paris, because within Mary's mind there lies all possible dreams. Everything that could possibly be dreamed lives within Mary's mind. But while she is awake, she doesn't have access to those dreams. So in order to realize, that is, make real, in order to realize that one of the dreams that lies in potential in her mind, she has to fall asleep. So Mary falls asleep, and in falling asleep she is able to imagine a world within her own mind. So on this occasion she imagines the streets of Paris. But she cannot see the streets of Paris directly, because the infinite cannot know the finite directly. So as she dreams the streets of Paris, she simultaneously localizes herself as one of the people on the streets of Paris. In other words, her own mind, which is a single, indivisible field of consciousness, albeit a limited one, divides itself into a subject and an object. A subject, Jane, on the streets of Paris. The object, the streets of Paris. So the subject and the object are co-created within Mary's mind. And what in reality is the activity of Mary's mind is perceived from Jane's point of view as an outside world made out of something other than mind, which Jane's colleagues called matter. So it appears from Jane's localized point of view that mind is what exists on the inside of her and matter is what exists on the outside of her. That's how it appears from Jane's limited, localized and ultimately illusory point of view. Now, when Mary wakes up, she realizes, that there was no world. There was no separate mind. There was no separate self. There were no people. There were no objects. All there was the activity of my own mind. So that's the creation story, and it's an accurate and direct replica of the understanding we have here, namely that infinite consciousness, in this case, Mary's mind in the analogy is limited. In this case, infinite consciousness, being infinite, can only know its own being, because the infinite can only know the infinite. There's no room in the infinite for the finite, because if the finite existed within the infinite, then the finite would displace a part of the infinite's infiniteness, and it would then no longer be infinite. So there's no room for the finite in the infinite. So the infinite knows nothing of the finite. Infinite consciousness only knows its own being. That's why its nature is peace and joy and love, absence of other. However, within infinite consciousness lies all possible experiences, all possible realms, all possible worlds. It's a field of infinite potentiality, which is inherently without form. But in order to realize one of those forms, one of those worlds, consciousness must fall asleep to itself. It must forget itself. It must overlook itself. And that enables it not only to dream the world within its own mind, but to localize itself in its own world. In this case, not as one separate subject of experience, but as numerous separate subjects of experience. That's each of us. So we are the apparently separate selves, localized perspectives within infinite consciousness, made only of infinite consciousness, through whose agency, that is, through whose sense faculties, consciousness views what is in fact its own activity as an outside world. Now, from the perspective of each of us, from our limited localized perspectives, it seems that the outside world is made out of stuff other than ourselves, separate from ourselves, distinct from our minds, which we feel exist on the inside of ourselves. And the name we give to that stuff is, yes, matter. So from the limited and localized point of view of the separate subjects of experience that we seem to be, it seems that the world is made out of stuff other than mind, matter. Of course, when consciousness wakes up, so to speak, it realizes that the entire universe is its own activity, that all that is there is consciousness, is itself and its own activity. But its own activity appears as an outside world when viewed from the localized perspective of a separate subject of experience in that world. Now, what is called sin in the Christian tradition, in the Vedantic tradition, is called ignorance. And ignorance in common parlance, ignorance means stupidity. In the Vedantic sense of the word, ignorance doesn't mean stupidity. It has no pejorative connotation. It means the ignoring of reality. Consciousness must ignore itself. Consciousness must fall asleep to itself in order to realize the world that lies in potential within it. And that is the original sin that they talk about in Christianity. It is the original forgetting or overlooking of the nature of reality. And as consciousness overlooks itself or ignores itself and localizes itself as a separate subject of experience within its own dream, it loses touch with its own nature of happiness. And that is why the one thing that all separate selves truly want is happiness. They don't really want an object, a substance, an activity, a relationship. What they want is something which will bring their sense of separation to an end and reveal to them their original nature. In other words, although the separate self conceives of its search in terms of happiness or even enlightenment, all it really wants is to be divested of its sense of separation, and as such to be revealed as the infinite being that it truly is.
I think I'm following most of that. I had a hunch, because I think the day before yesterday you had mentioned consciousness trying to squeeze itself within infinite consciousness, squeezing itself within finite consciousness. I can't remember all of the context.
Okay, so that's Mary seeming to become Jane in the dream. That's consciousness, infinite consciousness, becoming each of our finite minds. I refer to us as a finite mind, a bundle of thinking, feeling, sensing, and perceiving. So when I use the word finite mind, I'm referring to us. So it's not really that consciousness squeezes itself into us, because consciousness never expands or contracts. it just seems to localize itself. It's not as if consciousness has localized itself into the form of each of our finite minds, and everything else is not consciousness. No, everything is consciousness. So consciousness is always in the same condition. It never expands, it never contracts, it never moves, it never changes, it never evolves. But it seems to localize itself as a separate subject of experience. So we could say that the world, or the universe, is what the unlocalized aspect of consciousness's activity looks like from our localized perspectives. So a human being, or indeed an animal, is what a localization of consciousness looks like from a second-person perspective. The world is what the unlocalized aspect of consciousness's activity looks like from a second-person perspective. Is that clear?
Yes, that's helpful.
When I say a second-person perspective, if you close your eyes now and ask yourself, what is my experience? You say, in the context of this conversation, you would say, thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving. That's what you're experiencing. But when I look at you, I don't see a bundle of thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving. I see a body. Now, it's not that the bundle of thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving in you is one thing called mind, and your body is another thing made out of matter. No, that the mind and the body are, there's not a relationship between them. They are the same thing. What I see as a physical body, from my second-person perspective, your view of yourself is your first-person perspective. My view of you is a second-person perspective. So your view of yourself is thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving. My view of you, my view of the same bundle of thinking, feeling, sensing and perceiving is a body. So the body and the mind are just two different viewpoints of the same thing. What is that same thing? The localized activity of consciousness. And this is why there is such a tight correlation between the mind and the body. They're not related. They are the same thing. When we experience ourselves from the inside, we experience ourselves as mind. When somebody views us from the outside, they experience us as a body. It's just two different views of the same thing. And what is that same thing? The localized activity of consciousness. What is the world? It is the second-person perspective on the unlocalized activity of consciousness.
I'm working on it. Yeah, I appreciate.
Okay. Go back to the question was. Sorry, what's your name? Tom asked, didn't get the bit about the world being the second-person perspective of the unlocalized aspect of consciousness. Let's relate this to Mary and Jane, because it's easier. Mary falls asleep in Burlingame. She dreams that she's Jane on the streets of Paris. So Jane is what I call a localization of Mary's mind. Mary localizes her as Jane. You understand that? So everything else, the streets of Paris, is that aspect of Mary's mind that is not localized as Jane. It's still the activity of Mary's mind, but it's that part of Mary's mind that is not localized. So Mary's mind localizes itself in the form of Jane, and all the rest of its activity, which is unlocalized, appears as the world. So what I'm suggesting is that infinite consciousness localizes itself in the form of each of our minds, and that aspect of its own activity that is not localized as each of us is the world. Isn't it elegant? It's a creation myth, and of course it's a myth. I'm not suggesting that this is an accurate model of reality. There are no accurate models of reality, but it's the most accurate one I know. And if you look back, all the world's great traditional societies and many of the world's great religions have this, in one form or another, they have this story of the absolute dreaming or imagining the world within itself and localizing itself as a person in that world. Look at God and Christ. It's the same thing. Christ is God incarnate. It's the same thing. It's the same story. But of course, people forgot its real meaning and attributed more independent existence to the person Jesus than was ever intended. Jesus himself never credited himself with his own independent existence. He was always deferring to his Father.
Yes.
So, and you find this in the Hindu scriptures. You find it in traditional cultures. It's this idea of that reality is a dream in the mind of an infinite being, and each of us are the eyes and ears of that being, through which that being perceives itself as the universe. And it's the best model of reality I know. And what's beautiful about it, apart from anything, is that it does not resort to anything that we do not directly experience. We don't have to imagine a creator God to account for our experience of the world. We don't have to imagine a substance called matter, which supposedly exists outside consciousness, which nobody has ever found or could ever found. Matter is a completely abstract idea. No physicist has ever found the stuff called matter. And yet our world culture is founded upon the assumption that matter is the fundamental reality of the universe from which consciousness is derived. But this is completely at odds with the evidence of experience. Is anybody here currently knowing anything other than the knowing of experience? Has anyone here, or could anyone here ever know anything other than the knowing of experience? Think of all the billions of people that have ever existed or will ever exist, including all the animals. Have any of them, do any of them, could any of them ever experience anything other than the knowing of experience? Could God, whatever God is, ever know anything other than the knowing of experience? No. All that is ever known is knowing. So if we want to build a model of reality, why don't we start with the one fact that we are absolutely certain of, the one substance that we all experience all the time, namely consciousness or knowing. And that's the beauty of this model. It just starts with experience. And if it's not necessary to if it's not necessary to introduce another substance in order to account for everything we experience, then why do it? It's perfectly possible to account for everything we experience, using only consciousness as the fundamental reality. It's not necessary to add another substance called matter. Whereas the matter model, it first of all has to imagine a substance that has never been experienced, and then imagine that that is the fundamental reality of the universe. I mean, how convoluted is that? It then goes on to imagine that consciousness, the only thing that is ever truly known, is derived from matter, which is never known. It's madness. It doesn't stand the scrutiny of experience. It doesn't stand up to reason. And if you probe hard enough, it doesn't stand up to empirical evidence. So I think it's a beautiful model. And at first, I intuited this. It's one of the things my mother frequently reminds me of. apparently said to her when I was a 7-year-old boy, I think that everything is God's dream, and our job in this life is to make God's dream as beautiful a dream as possible. So I had this childish, innocent intuition when I was 7, and to be honest, I haven't evolved very much. I still think the same. I'm a little bit more sophisticated in the way I explain it, but I still think the same way. I think everything is just God's dream, and we are God's eyes and ears through which it perceives itself as the universe. And that the way I expressed it as a 7-year-old boy, I think our job is to make God's dream as beautiful a dream as possible. I would express that slightly, not so differently actually, but I would say our role as individuals, as apparent individuals, is to bring this understanding that we are speaking of into the world in some form. When I say in some form, I mean in the form of truth, in the form of love, or in the form of beauty.
Thank you, Rupert.